and then he depicts it, and he's expecting you to feel certain things. So you've got the author who's a mind, and the character who's a mind, and the author is an image of you as a mind, and your own actual mind. And all of those minds working together, that's the literary experience. It's not just words on a page, it's not just a set of abstract relationships, it's all those minds getting together and interacting through words. So you've got that, and then if you're an English major, you go down here to this bottom part of the diagram, all that stuff there, the functional structure, the parts of the narrative, and that's the technical detail. Once you become English majors, you go into analyzing plot and theme, and the organization of the narrative. And in a course on literary theory, you turn it around and you look at the top, and you look at ideas about literature. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that you're getting in, taking a course like this, you're getting in on the ground floor of what will increasingly be the dominant mental set of almost all educated people. That is, every day in the newspaper there's more information about hormones and genes and neurotransmitters, and over the next 5 or 6 decades that you'll be living your adult lives, the whole sense of what it means to be human will be increasingly, already is profoundly, and will be increasingly dominated by biology. And when we get to literary theory, we're getting to what is E.O. Wilson calls the last frontier. E.O. Wilson's a great biologist, wrote a book called Consilience, which is about unifying all the disciplines under the aegis of biology, unifying the social sciences and the humanities. And his argument is that if biology is the ultimate framework of explanation for human experience, then it necessarily has to be the basis for all the social sciences and also for the humanities. If human beings have evolved, and if their minds have evolved in an adaptive relationship to the environment, and they have complex anatomical and neurological and physiological structures that have evolved, and if their emotions and their thoughts and their cognitive biases, if all of those things have been shaped by their evolution, then the only right way to understand what goes on in their minds and how they behave is to locate all of their behavior and all of their thoughts and the books they write and the songs they sing and the movies they make, to locate all of that in relationship to the evolved and adapted structure of their bodies and their brains. And I believe that. I think that's true. It seems to me that it's the kind of idea that has an almost axiomatic logic to it. That it seems, I know from experience that if somebody tells you, well, really you can only understand literature in relation to biology, the first thought is, wait a minute, I studied biology in high school, and that has the Krebs cycle and molecules, and I had to memorize lists of bones, and what the hell does that have to do with literature? But what I'm trying to get over to is that all of the details of biology add up to certain really big basic structures in your brain, and all of those things influence all of your imagination. So if you're in literary study now, you've got all these possible ways, all possible ideas that you can adopt. If you ended up as an English major, you'd be studying, if you took a course in literary theory, you'd be studying Marxism, which would get you at social economic theory. You'd be studying Freudianism, which would be a way to get at your psychology. A lot of what you do would be studying gender theory, the theory of patriarchy, it's a way to get at sex, and language theory. My belief is that whatever is valid in any of those approaches can ultimately be subsumed, can be integrated into a biological perspective, and that biology can provide a better basis for understanding human social interaction than Marxism, and a better basis for understanding the development of the human mind than Freudianism, and a better basis for understanding language than deconstruction or speech act theory, and a better basis for understanding sex and gender identity than you will get from any kind of politically charged theory of patriarchy. So there are all these possibilities there, and I'm hoping and in optimistic moments predicting that ultimately they'll all just sort of fade away and be organized in a better, more adequate biological way of looking at things. So this is, if you were going to take a biological approach to literature, over here on the left you've got the biocultural complex. You'd be looking at human universals, that is, the kinds of things that appear in every known human society. If I were going to recommend one book that you read as an introduction to the evolutionary approach to human nature, probably I'd recommend an anthropological book, Donald Brown's Human Universals. And it's just a study of the kinds of behavior that are found in every known culture. For example, some form of sexual division of labor, some form of marriage, recognized kin relations, stories, jokes, all of those are human universals. They appear in every known culture. The implication is that if they appear in every known culture, then they probably weren't produced by any particular culture. They're built into the human organism. So it's a way of getting a foundation for what it means to have a human nature, a built-in, genetically transmitted set of dispositions for behaving in certain ways. But you also want to fit it into a specific cultural context. You want to see the way in any given culture marriage changes. There are many different kinds of marriage. There are polygamous societies where men have multiple wives. There are even a couple of polyandrous societies where a wife will have more than one husband. There are monogamous societies. There are societies with serial monogamy. So marriage appears, it's a human universal, but it varies a lot by culture. And that's true of almost any human universal you can mention. Think of language. People have a language instinct, to use Steven Pinker's phrase. They're born with the ability, the disposition to acquire language. But the language that they acquire depends on the culture in which they're born. If you're born in Japan, you learn Japanese. If you're born in America, you learn English or Spanish. Okay, so that's literary meaning. Now I'm going to give you just a little background to this specific movement, literary Darwinism. I'm not sure how much history you've had about the development of Darwinian thinking over the past half century or so. There was a period running from roughly 1910 to roughly 1975 where biology was more or less excluded from consideration in the social sciences and in humanities. It was just sociology, political science, even psychology wanted to go on their own, work out principles and ideas that applied only within their fields, and that had no dependence, no reference to biology, no dependence on biology. Well, around about 1975, that started changing. And the people who were your age in 1975 were just becoming aware of new ideas, the possibility of sociobiology, thinking about humans like as if they were any other species. But they had a big uphill battle to win their way in the world. I read a book recently by Doug Kenrick, Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life. You know, the sociobiologists have good titles. And you know, he's my age now, and he tells he gives a personal narrative, a trajectory, where he had to struggle and overcome resistance to get anything published and fight a hard fight. But then at a certain point, there were departments all over the country, all over the world, where evolutionary psychology was an established thing, and now he's looking back and thinking we've made it, really. Not everybody is an evolutionary psychologist, but we can be confident that we've passed the watershed. From this point on, it's just a matter of waiting until the final resistance. There's an old saying that science progresses one obituary at a time. And so, you know, there are people who are still resisting, but eventually they'll die. The new people, you know, the reason people are most interested, the reason you can depend on it growing, is that that's where the growth is. That's where knowledge can be found. There are all kinds of exciting things to do there, and you can be quite sure that it's going to connect with other things that other people are doing. You're going to keep having new findings. So around about 1992, there was a book published called The Adaptive Mind, and by Tooby and Cosmides and Barco, and that put evolutionary psychology very firmly on the map. I think that was an essay in that book that's been one of the most cited essays over the past 30 or 40 years. And that particular school, I'm going to call it narrow school evolutionary psychology. It fixed on certain basic human drives that are very closely related to the drives or motives of other species, animals of other species, survival, growing up, sociality, mating, parenting, and kinship. But it didn't really know what to do with the more complex, specifically human kinds of behavior like technology and science and philosophy and the arts. So what it said was that all those things are really just sort of side effects of cognitive abilities that evolve for other purposes. So they were important for establishing that there's a real continuity between animal motives and human motives, but they didn't go far enough in bringing in the whole range of what is really human. So roughly, say 2005, you could identify books that had dealt with the problem of general intelligence, the fact that humans have the ability of abstract thinking and analysis. And so I'm going to call that broad school evolutionary psychology. And they kept all of the ideas of the basic human motives, survival, growing up, sociality, mating, but they said that if you add in the general intelligence, then you can explain technology and social organization and philosophy and science. So that's broad school evolutionary psychology. And the last school, and I think it really is the last school, not the last idea for sure, but filling out the basic pattern in a way that had to be done, humanist evolutionary psychology. If you take everything that the people in narrow school evolutionary psychology thought, and you add in general intelligence from broad school psychology, and then you add in the imagination and the human need to create an imaginative world through religion and art, music and stories, finally you get a more or less complete picture of the human mind, the specifically human mind, linking that mind with animal motives and going all the way up to art and literature. So here's just another diagram that says, think of this like a baseball or a golf ball with a hard little core right there in the middle. Narrow school evolutionary psychology, rage, hunger, lust, basic drives, animal impulses. And then around that, not excluding that, not suppressing it, but developing it, you've got general intelligence. And then finally, on the outermost core, you've got the imagination, the way we make sense of all of our behavior and give it a direction. And then that would be the fully human mind. Charlotte mentioned the issue of the adaptive function of fictional narratives. Since you've read John's book, you'll be already familiar with these ideas, and I've already talked about them. Why we make stories, why that's important to us. We live in imagination. I don't know if you've ever had an experience called lucid dreaming, where you're dreaming and you're aware that you're dreaming, and then you wake up. I had one recently where I was having a really, really vivid dream, and I thought, is this a dream? So I tested it empirically. I think I reached out and pinched myself or something. I said, no, this is not a dream, this is real. And then I woke up. And in a way, there's no gap there. You know, you wake up from dreaming into a world where your mind is still creating images all around you. You're not just taking in sensory perceptions like a photographic plate. You're shaping them. Everything you drift off. You're talking to somebody. You say, "Oh wait a minute, I'm sorry. I just started having a daydream. I just started sort of drifting off." You'll have to say that again. We live in an imaginative virtual world. We imagine ourselves doing things in that world, and then we make ourselves do them. You know, you think, I'm going to be a doctor when you're 10 years old. You think, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a doctor. And you imagine yourself going through the whole process of taking the right courses and becoming an intern and working 40 hours at a stretch. And you actually then go through and do all of those things, and you imagined it, and you become what you imagined. About the only time when you don't become what you imagine is when you're totally enslaved and forced to do things that other people demand of you. But even then, you create a myth, you create an image of yourself, you make life worth living by having a story in which your life has meaning. So, as I said, we've kind of passed the point of no return with the development of evolutionary psychology. It's pervading the whole general culture. Every year, the New York Times bestseller list, nonfiction bestseller list, there are books by anthropologists and psychologists and linguists and neuroscientists. So it's there, it's never going to go away, it's only going to keep developing. And I think that's not really controversial. I don't think most people would disagree with that. It's much more controversial to say that this is going to be the way of the future in literary study, because it's still marginal in literary study. Most academic departments of literature still aren't very welcoming to evolutionary ideas. They get hostile, they get upset, they get frightened, they get angry. So, you know, where will things go? How are things going to develop in the future? Well, one possibility is that there could just be a continuation of the way things are now. There are, I don't know, 40 or 50 of us out there in the world. That's not very many. There are 30,000 members of the Modern Language Association, which is the association of teachers of English and languages. It's possible that it could just continue that way. I don't think it will, partly just because things don't tend to continue one way. Things are always changing. So another possibility is that literary Darwinism, the evolutionary approach to the humanities, will be considered, okay, we wish you'd just go away, but you won't, so we'll accept you as just another school, another group of theory. We've got the Marxists, we've got the deconstructionists, we've got the feminists, we've got the Freudians, and now, much as we regret it, we've also got the Darwinians. And I think there's a phase that will be a phase. It's already starting to happen. I got a request just last week from a guy who's David Richter, is just a standard academic literary theorist. He's putting together a big handbook for some major publishing company, and it's on literary theory. He's going to have the Marxists and the Freudians and the feminists, and he said, and you know, okay, we'll have a Darwinian. You can write a Darwinian essay. So I am going to do it, but I'm going to say, oh, by the way, I plan to make all these other folks obsolete. So that's the third option, and the one that seems to almost everybody except me, the least likely. It's the one where all those other approaches, whatever's right or true in them, gets absorbed into a more complete and adequate theory, so that at a certain point, 50 years from now, who knows, I really couldn't even begin to say, you won't really have evolutionary psychology, because all psychology will be biologically grounded, and you won't really have a Darwinist approach to literature because the general frame of knowledge for all educated people will be evolutionary. So humanities study will just necessarily fall into that pattern too. So that's the current historical situation. It's kind of interesting, you know, you'll live long enough to be able to see how this thing goes. So send me a message to the other side and just tell me how it all turned out. So now I'm going to talk a little about human life history theory, the subjects of fiction. Life history theory is a subject in theoretical biology. Every species has a life history that is a very typical pattern of birth, growth, reproduction, and death. You know, for a salmon, for example, you know, you're born as a little salmon from an egg. You don't have any parents. You know, they died before you were born, but you float down the river and you go out to sea, and you know that's what you're supposed to do. You spend 4 or 5 years out in the ocean, and then at a certain point you just get this overwhelming, irresistible urge to migrate back up that stream, to navigate past bears and leap over falls and get to a point where you spawn and leave your eggs and then you die. And that's your life history as a salmon. And if you're a human being, you have a life history that involves all kinds of features that are similar to the life histories of other species. Like all mammals, your life history includes live birth, being born from the uterus of your mother, and nursing, suckling at her mammary glands, and bonding to her and being protected by her. But unlike most mammals, part of your life history is that there's some adult male somewhere in the picture. Pair bonding and dual parenting is a specific feature of the human life history. And it's common among birds, but it's rare among mammals. So for humans to be able to do that, it's a peculiar kind of thing. It happens when the offspring requires so much care that it's really not possible for a mother to do it by herself. That's why it's true for birds. So for human nature, you've got mating, birth, and then the family as a common human universal, some form of organized relationships between males and females and parenting care of children. And you've got a long old age. It's a peculiar feature of the human life history pattern. Postmenopausal survival. That's a unique human feature, actually, that in other species, the female is reproductively capable until just shortly before death. But in humans, there's menopause and a long period of survival after that. And the hypothesis that seems most plausible is that human infants require longer to develop and require more care, and grandmothers have been a crucial part of the taking a burden off of a mother to make it possible to raise offspring. Humans have an extremely long lifespan, and they have a really complicated social life. Unlike many mammals, they organize themselves in groups, and unlike any other species, they have cooperative groups of males combined with pair bonding between males and females. So you've got all that sexual tension and the threat of infidelity, and that's just built into the human life history pattern. And it's different from any pattern of any other species. So the argument I'm going to make is that this pattern, this basic set of the organization of the simple necessities of survival and growth and reproduction and the care of infants and social interaction, that all of that forms the basis of the whole human motivational and emotional system. It's what gives you the passions and drives that lead you through life. And what literature does is to depict those things, to represent them, to evoke the feelings that are associated with them, and to put them into some meaningful pattern. We're constantly reading stories that give us models of behavior. We're trying to find out how we want to be, the kind of lives we want to live, and we watch movies, and we read books, and we listen to songs, and we think, yeah, that's the kind of thing I want to do. That's how I want to live. So we've got human nature, that basic pattern. Then we've got all those specific cultures, the Egyptian or the Persian, the Maori or the Manhattanite, in which those very specific behaviors are replicated, but with all these obvious differences in style and manner. And then within any specific culture, we've got individual artists like Shakespeare or Frida, who have their own personalities, their own temperaments, their own peculiar experiences, and that peculiarity and individuality shapes everything that they think and feel. And then they have their particular works of art that differs from moment to moment. There's one of Frida's paintings, Frida Kahlo. So that's the basic argument here, is that you can actually limit, you can identify the main categories of human concern, the things that people care about, what matters to them, and how they organize their lives. Survival, this is a big one, you know. As soon as your life is in danger, everything else becomes secondary. Everything else is put on hold. And your physiology is built that way too. If you're threatened physically, fight or flight responses kick in, and your breathing picks up, your pulse rate picks up, blood drains away from your peripheral parts of your face will go completely wide as the blood retreats to your muscles and your organs. So survival. And of course you can think of all kinds of stories that are geared towards survival. Growing up, you know, for humans, growing up is hard to do. It's complicated, it's fraught with more demands on your, you have to go through more transformations of your mind than any other species. There's a much longer period of childhood development. There are different phases in which there's development of the neurons in your brain continues all the way into the late teens. Whenever I look at, my daughter's a federal prosecutor, a U.S. assistant attorney, and she believes that we should not have a war on drugs. She thinks that it's just a waste of money and time and effort. But I think of all those 16-year-olds out there whose brains are still developing, and think, no, I'd do almost anything to keep those brains free from the effects of toxic chemicals. Sex and love. I mean, you know, turn on the radio, listen to the music. I haven't done a statistical study, but I'd say 80–90% of it, you know, is sex and love. That really, if you don't have a love story in a movie, it's rare. If there's a novel that doesn't have a love story, they'll go stick the love story in when they turn it into a movie. It's just, you know, family. Family is the one thing that ties us up into the most emotional knots and sticks with us longer than anything else. From talking to other people and from my own experience, I can predict that long after your parents are gone to their reward, you will still be having dreams about them. You know, the family sticks with you. Life in the tribe, interacting with other people, you can't get along without it. You know, as soon as a society becomes civilized enough to stop torturing people or executing them, the worst thing they can do to them, the most extreme punishment that's possible, is solitary confinement. People need people. Even psychopaths need people. They just need to interact with people. And then aliens and enemies, people organize themselves into tribes and think about other tribes as enemies. just reading this morning about if you went to Russia and talked to any of the Russians there about what's going on in Ukraine, you would hear that a story that is completely different from the story that you've heard here. The story that all of Russian television is telling to their citizens is that the United States started that whole conflict as a means of pulling Ukraine into the Western orbit and attacking Russia. So they're organizing their whole culture now into an imagination of a story in which their heroic victims fending off attacks by wealthy and corrupt bourgeois Western democracies. And finally, I think again that specifically human, all of these other things, there are particularly human forms of them, but still, survival, growing up, sex, kinship, social life, all of those things they're part of the animal world. But you get to the life of the mind, and you get to art and music and literature and religion and philosophy, and that's specifically human in a special way. So I'm just going to give you some examples quickly. Survival. How many of you read To Build a Fire? Anybody? No? Okay. Just a guy in the Yukon, it's 60 degrees below, and he sets out alone. Everybody tells him, don't do it. Don't travel by yourself when it's 60 degrees below. But he does, won't listen, and steps into water, fast running water, and is desperate to build a fire to unfreeze his feet. And can't do it. And then spends the last few minutes of his life dreaming of being picked up and saved. All right, how many of you read some Stephen King? I thought, better, okay. Well, fear, the ability to be, the sense that there are dangerous things out there, we are not safe, they're out to get us. And the whole world of horror literature is built on that. Edgar Allan Poe. Okay. Growing up, here are just some stories about growing up. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. There's Harry, his parents are dead and being raised by wicked relatives, but he still has an imagination of his parents and uses images of them to help form his own identity. And these are other examples. Roald Dahl. How many of you ever read Roald Dahl? James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, the BFG. All those wicked, brutal, vicious adults just dominating children. In the course I'm teaching now, for this section of the course, I'm growing up, I used, one thing I used was his memoir, Boy, which is about going to English public schools. And I realized that all those stories, all those fictional stories, that's not fiction, that's just what happened to him. Just all those terrible adults whacking on him. And then Sex and Love, Romeo and Juliet, Pride and Prejudice, Women in Love, Anna Karenina. It's just the one thing that you can be sure people will never be tired of. You get to be 80 years old, all dried up, you couldn't do it if you wanted to, and you don't want to, but you'll still read about it, it's still interesting. Oedipus Rex, that's sort of a basic family drama, horror story. What's the worst thing that could happen in my family? Well, I could murder my father and have sex with my mother. I particularly like this one on the bottom right, Jonathan Prince and the Corrections. He's in St. Louis, and it's a story built on his own childhood. He's a little boy sitting here in the corner, and his mother and father are fighting, and they hate each other. And his mother, in order to get back at his father, makes a dinner with all the things that he hates the most: liver and rutabaga and greens. And his father has a rule that you can't leave the table until you've eaten all of that stuff. So he just refuses to do it. And he sits there, and there's a standoff, and finally his head drops and smacks down into his plate. But he's traumatized for life by that night at the dinner table. And that's life in the tribe, the social group. A lot of stories are about, one of the books I taught was the Lord. Has anybody read Lord of the Flies? Yeah. Okay. Just a bunch of boys, middle of the nuclear war, they're marooned on an island. They want to do the right thing, and they get the conch and kind of get together and make rules, and then a bunch of them go back to savagery and murder. And, so organizing society. So these are just ways of saying that there are these main categories that you can group stories into because they reflect the basic concerns that all people have. Just yesterday in the other class I taught this class, we used All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a World War I novel. These people locked into senseless, maniacal, mutual slaughter on a gargantuan scale, just because they're driven by passions that they don't understand and can't control. One of the things to be said for having an evolutionary understanding of human behavior is that the more you understand the machine, the better you are able to regulate it. And we're moving into a phase of the world where we seriously need to understand the machinery, with the possibility of nuclear holocaust or ecological disaster, and almost virtual certainty of ecological disaster. The more we understand human behavior and the machinery that drives it, the better we'll be able to avoid the final disaster. And then finally, the life of the mind. Here are just some examples of stories that involve people imagining and thinking and creating and wondering. So that's it.
We have just a little bit of time for questions. Anyone wants to ask anything? I found it interesting, Bill, on that list you have of the main topics or the subjects. Just yesterday I was working on writing the press release for my upcoming book for my publisher. We spend all this time trying to have it be all original and really express my individuality, and I realized you had like half of those words that we're using. Family, survival, I took out love. But half of what you had up there is going into this press release, which is about a paragraph.
What do you think about the fact that there's books about self-destructive behavior, like those from the underground, and it seems like the cliche is that a lot of writers kill themselves. So like, how does suicide work into this theory?
Yeah, I have an essay on violence and homicide in literature. It was a big anthology about evolutionary approaches to violence and homicide. And I did one of the chapters on literature. And I had a whole chunk on suicide, which shows up a fair amount in literature. I don't think it's possible to talk about suicide plausibly as an adaptive strategy. And there may be, occasionally there's an instance, but sometimes people have tried to do that. They're trying to say that, for example, heroic self-sacrifice when soldiers throw themselves on grenades to save their companions, that it's a way of gaining status or honor, and that'll benefit their kin, but I don't believe that. I think that suicide is by and large pathological, that it's a breakdown, that it's the human system I saw a documentary once about a new generation of fighter planes, and they're incredibly complicated, technological. And they interviewed one of the mechanics who was complaining bitterly. He said these are hangar queens, meaning that they spend half their time in the hangar being repaired. And humans are kind of like that, you know. They're so complicated and they're so fragile and vulnerable in so many ways that it's pretty easy to foul the system so that it's unbearable, intolerable. Anybody see that new Brad Pitt movie, The Fury? No? Okay. Well, it's a new movie about World War II movie about a tank that's has to defend a crossroads against attack, you know, overnight. It's a heroic last stand. Everybody dies. Oh, sorry. Oh well. But at a certain point, as they're approaching, there's another tank, and it's hit with a bazooka, and a man leaps out of the tank, and he's on fire, and burning all over. And the last thing he's able to do is to pull out his gun and shoot himself in the head, which is the only thing to do, because he's going to die, but you're in agony. And basically, suicide is the escape that people take when they can't get out of their own minds and their minds are intolerable. Right. So self-destructive behaviors, I mean, there are lots of self-destructive behaviors that aren't all the way to suicide. Alcoholism, drug addiction, video games. I mean, I knew a guy once who got a fellowship to finish his dissertation and spent the next year becoming the past master of video games. Just got all the way to the highest level. Kind of thing, at the end of that, you expect somebody actually to take out a gun and shoot themselves. People are vulnerable. They have buttons that they can push to create pleasure, and they're just really vulnerable to succumbing to temptations. Being a person is harder, I think, in a lot of ways than being any other kind of animal. Because you have to organize and direct and be conscious and exercise willpower. And a lot of people just don't manage it very well.
So it sounds like literary Darwinists are getting some pushback. Maybe the doors aren't opening in a very friendly way. You said in English departments, right? And then I imagine also from certain religious groups too that see this door opening into yet another field of inquiry.
Yeah, it's one of the funny places where people that you wouldn't expect to have a whole lot to do with one another, religious fundamentalists on the one side and Marxist queer theorists on the other side, are, you know, saying, yeah, I don't like most of what you say, but I agree with Darwinists, you know, they're bad. So yeah, no, there's a resistance to Darwinism, of course, in religious circles. There's a resistance in ideological circles that have a kind of a religious fervor about the ideology. On the other hand, we're welcomed often by evolutionary psychologists. Most of the lectures I've given over the past 10 years, most of the books I've been invited to contribute chapters to, the edited books, have been produced by anthropologists and psychologists rather than literary people. So there's an opening for, there are a lot of people who believe that it's possible to unify knowledge within evolution, within an evolutionary framework of ideas, and they're open to literary Darwinism. As I say, the literary people are just starting to.
Is the main pushback amongst literary people one of nature versus nurture?
That's it, right. The people in the literary world still firmly believe that there are no biologically based attributes, dispositions that direct behavior. They believe that human motives and feelings and values are all a result of cultural conditioning. So that even really basic things like sex, biological sex. I had a student in one of my classes who announced to the whole class, that it was a graduate literary class, literary theory class, that science has now identified 6 distinct sexes in the human species. I'm not sure where she got that, but it's just the idea that
What does that mean?
yeah, and God only knows what that even means, but it's just the idea that there is no actual, if you went to the Modern Language Association conference and took a group of, just randomly selected out of the thousands of people there, a group this size, and stood in front of them and said, how many of you believe that anatomical and physiological differences and the hormonal differences have a significant influence on gender identity? Almost nobody would say that they do. So, it's like a religious conviction. There's an interesting article recently. Jonathan Haidt, who's an important psychologist, said that when we talk about the influences of biology on sex, we enter into a range that is essentially a religious range. People have a kind of they're not willing to look at evidence, they're not even willing to think about it, they just have a passionate conviction about that. And so, I think that as the secular educated public lost its religious faith, they didn't lose the need to believe fervently in certain ideals, and they just locked on to the idea of nurturing. There are reasons for that. Why would people want to believe that nurture is overwhelmingly important and that nature is not? Well, if you believe that, then you also believe that human behavior can be shaped by conscious institutional, governmental, cultural activity so that you can create an ideal society. When Edward O. Wilson published Sociobiology in 1975, a group of his colleagues at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin and some others, created a group called Science for the People, meaning Marxist science. And they wrote, somebody reviewed it in the New York Review of Books, the book Sociobiology, and given it a favorable review. And they wrote in a letter saying that anybody who believes that biology has a significant influence on human behavior believes that only because he wants to justify and rationalize the existing power structures and the injustices that result from it. So a belief in the possibility of reform, of making people equal and happy, is the basis for rejecting the idea that biology conditions human behavior.
Last.
Do you, okay. Do you think that when it seems like religion might be part of the story, like people evolve to want the story? I've heard people say that if they didn't believe in God, then they would kill themselves,
Right.
and, like, to prevent the fragile human mind from breaking. So do you think this theory is possible, is compatible with religion?
It's not incompatible. It's perfectly possible to say that there was a God who set the whole process in motion. I think that in practice, though, once you get a feeling for the materialism and the contingency that are involved in evolutionary process, the role of a providential deity shrinks to insignificance for most people. At a certain point on the Origin of Species, Darwin speaks of the Creator having breathed life into one or a few forms so simple, and then they have evolved through natural processes. But in his autobiography, he says that those ideas gradually just sort of faded into nothing for him. And I think that's what happens for most people. It's hypothetically, it's still possible to say, yeah, there might be a God, but it just ceases to be imaginatively compelling.